So obviously it's been a pretty incredible couple months, right? I mean, you go from you're out there trying to make a difference, and now all of a sudden you've got a bestseller and you're on the most influential list of people, all because you come out and say maybe aid isn't a good thing. What's your bottom line premise?
We can do development much better in Africa. It's home to over 60% of the African population is under the age of 24, and Africans desperately want job opportunities and to be entrepreneurs. My message is very simple. We need to stop focusing on aid and handouts and really start to focus on the things that will deliver long-term growth and reduce poverty.
And what is that? If not aid, then what?
Well, it's a combination of trade and foreign direct investment, the capital markets, microfinance, savings, remittances. These are things that will spur economic growth and will also reduce poverty. We know that this works. This is the combination of things that has worked across the African continent in places like South Africa and Botswana, but in places like China and India, Brazil and Russia. So the real focus here is on job creation, and that's something that aid cannot do.
And how specifically has aid failed in that? I mean, aid has been tried in other countries around the world and been much more successful. And yet in Africa, it never seems to get very many countries above the bar.
Well, I think the type of aid interventions that have tended to work, as I talk about in the book, are things that have been short, sharp, and finite, not the open-ended commitments that pervade the African continent today. And I think that's critically important because what you want is to make sure that governments are incentivized to get a private sector going. And unfortunately, in an aid system, it allows governments, in many cases, to be quite lazy and in other words, not focus on developing a private sector.
And so if not aid, then what? How do you get big companies or even microfinance opportunities into Africa when so many people are so afraid of, well, the regime might change or the rules might change? How do you get that investment?
Well, I hope I'm one of the new voices coming out of the African continent, which are positive. There's so many amazing things going on the continent. We've spent so much time focusing on the negatives, and that's one of the things I have a problem with right now, is that the celebrity culture is so focused on the negative things. They talk about war and disease and poverty and corruption, and yet there's a vibrant young population coming up who are very excited and keen to participate in the global economy. Many countries are looking for young people, and Africa is home to that. We've got an amazing story in terms of land, arable land, and in terms of the mining sectors, and in terms of retail sectors. I mean, there's so many things that are so positive, and I think it's really important to focus on that rather than focus on the old staid model of aid and the negative story that's attached to that.
Do you think that aid is, in some fundamental way, condescending? Or it's sort of having pity for people when pity isn't necessarily what they need?
Oh, Africans definitely don't need pity. We're basically a proud continent, and it's a great pity that Africa and Africans are portrayed in such a negative fashion around the world. I mean, this is a continent that has got so many things going for it, and I think that's the message that we're trying to push now. We're ready for change. We're ready to go on a right path, the path that is tried and tested across the continent. And I really hope that will be the thing that spurs us to into the 21st century.
You have caused all sorts of tidal waves of conversation about this issue. And some have criticized you for saying, well, Dambisa Moyo is against any kind of charity. She says we shouldn't be giving bed nets to children in Africa when that's trying to fight malaria. Is that really what you're saying?
No. You know what? People are being deliberately obtuse, and I think it's actually intellectually dishonest to misquote me in such an obvious way. And what do I mean by that? I mean, obviously the best and most sustainable solution is for Africans to produce the bed nets so that people get an employment, and then we can produce bed nets on the African continent. Is there anything wrong with that? No. Of course, in the interim, there is scope for charitable interventions. I myself sit on the board of a number of charities. However, I understand those type of interventions to be band-aid solutions. They're not going to get Africa to grow at the requisite rates of growth to actually put a dent in poverty. And so I think we need to understand what those type of charitable interventions can and cannot do. We're looking for job creation on this continent. Aid has never created jobs for Africans, and it's critically important for us to remember that.
Many Americans watching tonight may think, what can they do? They may have given money to charities, as an example, and they may say, well, should I not do that? Should I do something different? What should I do? What would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them that it's fine to give money to charity as long as you understand what the limitations of that charity is. You're trying to create a sustainable, long-term solution here. And so there are many things that people can do on an individual basis. I've talked a lot about things like Kiva.org, which is an American-based computer interface where you can lend money to entrepreneurs for as little as $25 anywhere on earth.
And then they pay you back.
Of course.
But you're helping them get started.
Exactly. And that's critically important because you need to get the right incentives going. You need people to be incentivized to do the right thing. And unfortunately, an aid-based system does not incentivize many governments in Africa to do the right thing. And that's what I think is missing.
So when you define aid, obviously the bulk of traditional aid is low-cost loans from governments to African governments. How do you feel, let's say, about some of the major charitable focuses, the Fund for Malaria, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and some of their efforts? Are those things that should also be changed?
Well, there are three types of aid. There's humanitarian or emergency aid. So that's the kind of aid that would go to Fargo or to Katrina, right, or to an earthquake or a flood or tsunami. I have no qualms with that. And this is a lot from page 7 of my book, where I talk about the fact that there is a moral imperative for us to act as part of a global society, to actually do something when other people around the
of crisis.
Of course. The second type of aid is the NGO and charitable aid. And I guess I'll point to what I said earlier, which is basically that, yes, it might do something, but it's very much a Band-Aid solution. What we're trying to get to is a point where we get long-term solutions and job creation. Unfortunately, yes, a scholarship can send a girl to school, but it's not likely to help the economy to grow at 10%, for example, which could actually put a dent in poverty on a permanent basis. So my advice is, people can go ahead and give money to charities, but understand what the limitations are. Then, of course, the final type of aid, which is my book is really criticizing, is this $1 billion of government-to-government aid flows that do go into Africa every year, which unfortunately, in the worst-case scenario, fuel corruption. And in the best-case scenario, in many places across the African continent, allow governments to abdicate their responsibility of providing public goods like education and healthcare, security, and even infrastructure. So basically, it allows governments to have somebody else from outside come in and provide those goods.
Well, it would seem like one of the goals would be, just to be honest with you, is for people like you who go overseas and get amazing educations to choose to come home.
Absolutely.
That's what the goal would be, right?
Absolutely.
That instead of saying, if I want to do something amazing, I have to leave.
Yeah, and we're seeing that trend. Many countries where the governments are speaking the right language, they are concerned about economic development, they are focused on private sector development and free press and so on, all that good stuff that we really like to see. For those type of countries, we are seeing a trend of Africans going back home, and I think that we will see momentum in that space if there are opportunities for entrepreneurs. It's very simple. Africans want what everybody else wants. They want jobs. They do not want handouts. They want jobs.
Well, they want jobs. They want cars and washers and dryers and all of those things. And what about China? Now, China has been criticized heavily that they go in with investment, and when they do deliver, they either bring Chinese workers in instead of providing African jobs, as one criticism, and then the other is they give money with no strings attached, as in no strings in you need to be a democracy or you need to help your people.
Right.
Is China's way bad, or is that completely an unfair thing to say?
Oh, I think it's fundamentally unfair. I think that what the Chinese have done in Africa is to transform the playing field. The Chinese come to Africa very simply for business, and there is an opportunity for Africans to get jobs in that type of an environment. Now, of course, there are environmental issues, there are labor issues, but that's where African policy making needs to kick in. And, just to quote somebody from Africa, last week I was at home in Zambia, and it was very interesting because people said to me, well, the Americans borrow from the Chinese, and we don't hear anybody up in arms about that. And same in Europe. There are a lot of European companies that are being sold to the Chinese, and nobody's quibbling about their human rights record and so on and so forth. So, we need to remember that Africans are adults. African policymakers can stand up and say, you know what, Mr. China, we love you being here and bringing your investment, but please can you focus on making sure that Africans can benefit from your largesse.
Right, so it should be the governments that tell China how to operate, instead of saying China should be telling them how to run their country.
Absolutely. African governments are charged with that responsibility. They are elected by African people to act on their behalf, and therefore it is their responsibility to stand up and speak on behalf of the African people.
So you're saying that the traditional model of aid has failed. How has it failed, and what should we replace it with?
Fundamentally, the problem with the aid model is that it's not creating jobs across the African continent, and very much the aid interventions tend to be Band-Aid solutions, such as providing malaria nets or providing HIV drugs, which are important, but they are very, very narrow in the sense that they will not be able to generate long-term economic growth. What we need is job creation, and that requires investment. And so I think it's critically important for us to focus on investment, such as, for example, microfinance, which is one way in which you can actually finance an entrepreneur on the ground in Africa. But of course, at the more macro level, you can get more foreign direct investment, so sort of what we've seen from the Chinese in recent years.